to welcome all of you here tonight, scientists, friends, eurythmists, artists. These are important times that we live in. I know many of you feel that way, and those of us who worked to put this conference together as scientists feel strongly how science in its many fields are all reaching a kind of boundary, a threshold in their own fields and the ways that they're looking at things. If we go back 500 years, there was a Renaissance going on. And some of the great artists were also scientists in those times. Science, art, and religion were still one. But the grip of materialism took the sciences in a necessary and important direction. It is now time for those bridges to be built between the natural sciences and the spiritual sciences. And that is why we're gathered here. Can we build such bridges? Bridges where we know perhaps the foundations on the spiritual science side, but we also have to build a foundation at the other end of the bridge on the natural sciences. Can we envision a new Renaissance? What do we need for such a change in our attitudes and our understandings of what the human being is? So with that, the welcome to you comes from this excitement that we all have in our planning committee to put together this conference tonight. We have a number of new things we are attempting, and this equipment that you see here is indeed technology. We are live streaming to as many as 50 people across the globe tonight. So it's a very thrilling moment, and for all of you who are out there and not present here, but we welcome you here as much as you can be here. These recordings, by the way, will be available for up to a year. And as you've probably seen, there is on our website, a page to register to get these recordings afterwards or during. I just also want to mention a couple small things. Tomorrow morning, for those who are members of the School for Spiritual Science, there is a class lesson that will happen in the living room. If you come for breakfast tomorrow morning, which all of the people who have signed up for this conference are encouraged to participate in the meals. Much of our social interaction happens there and our social bonding. But the class lesson in the living room is 7:30 to 8:30. So if you see many of your friends in there, don't barge in, okay? We'll be having a first class lesson there. Breakfast is at 8:30, and then at 9:30 we have Eurythmy with Dorothea Meyer. And that will be in
the large room of the Eurythmy School.
At the Eurythmy School.
Yeah. Enter the Eurythmy School, the room on the right.
Right, room on the right. So it's on your maps if you have that in your packet. Is there a question? Okay. At 11 o'clock in the morning, we have a recap of tonight's lecture. Bring your questions, bring your thoughts. At 1:30 in the afternoon, we do experiential exercises. And unfortunately, the name is Open Space at 3:30, but we have filled all the open spaces. So, but please come, and your questions and thoughts and so on will be entertained at those sessions. And then we have, again, lectures every evening. So I want to bring up John Barnes to introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you all for being here.
Well, good evening to all of you. I am John Barnes, also a member of the steering group of the Natural Science section. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for tonight and for the next 3 nights, whose book is the subject of our conference, Peter Heusser. And judging by the little that I know of him, judging by his accomplishments and his character, I would say that he is to anthroposophical medicine what his compatriot Swiss Roger Federer is to tennis. Peter Heusser was born in the town of Reductionism in Switzerland, in the heart of Switzerland, at the one end of a long lake. At the other end of that lake, the Swiss Alps tower up towards the sky. Beautiful place. He was born in the middle of the last century, attended the public schools in the town. And already early on as a young man, he lived with some deep questions, which he told me on our way down here this afternoon. One was, what is the relationship between Eastern spirituality, which was sweeping through the West at that time when he was growing up, and Western science? Is there any bridge? What is their relationship to Christianity? And it's these questions which, through various ways, led him gradually to anthroposophy. He studied medicine at the University in Bern, Switzerland. He very soon met anthroposophy and began to train and also to work at the Ita Wegmann Clinic and the Lukas Clinic in Arlesheim, near Dornach. He worked his way up in the medical section at the Goetheanum, served in many capacities, also with the health insurance of his country, Switzerland, the national health insurance, evaluating the efficacy of complementary medicines and treatments. And finally, at the University of Bern, he established the first, I think it's the first in the world, a professorship for anthroposophical science, where he taught for many years as a full professor of anthroposophical science. Later on, he was called to the University of Witten-Herdecke in Germany to head up the department, where he's still active today. He authored around 400 publications, 120 of those in peer-reviewed journals. He wrote 25 books and contributions, articles to another 70 books. So, like Roger Federer, he has great accomplishments, but also has a very kind character. It's a pleasure to meet him today. So please join me in welcoming Peter Heusser.
Dear friends, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank John and his colleagues very much for having invited me here, and those who also have given the initiatives to that. And secondly, I would like just to apologize in case I don't find the words as we go on tonight, because I'm still suffering a little bit from jet lag, and then when I get tired, I have troubles finding the words sometimes. So, and for this reason, I also have a script, so I will partly, I hope not that I don't read too much, but so I just can skip to a certain, keep a certain line in my presentation. Well, the theme of tonight is there a place for the spirit in physics and chemistry? On the importance of epistemology for natural science. I would like to begin with a picture. And invite you to just shortly describe what you see. Just a few observations. What do you see? Patterns. Right. Pardon? You see the Fibonacci series? Okay. Spirals, yeah.
Perfection.
Perfection, yeah. Okay. So just some impressions. Where do you see that? Where? What's the location?
On the screen.
On the screen, right, here. Out there, here. Okay. Now, I'm going to write some numbers on the table. And those of you who are not mathematicians, please tell me what the next number should be. I start, and you just, then tell me what I have to write on the table, right? On the board. Can you read it? Yes.
Eight. 13. 21.
34.
Huh? 34? Okay.
55.
89. 44.
Two more.
233.
Huh?
233.
23.
Oh, 230.
Okay. Are you sure? Okay. Now, do you all agree that this is correct? For example, that this number is correct. All agree?
Yeah.
Okay. So there is a certain universality to what you just said. Every one of you could affirm, yes, that's the right solution. Now, what did you do? How did you get that result?
Added the two numbers.
Yes, you added the two previous numbers.
You figured out the pattern.
Pardon?
You figured out, or we figured out the pattern. There was a pattern.
Okay,
That
we'll
was
come to that.
established.
Right. Yes, you're right, of course. Now, where did you perceive that solution? Where's the locality where you got these numbers?
Not mine.
Your mind. Okay. Not out here, but inside yourself, right? Now, what kind of a, I still need that. So what kind of a perception is that? What's the nature of that perception inwardly, as opposed to the one out there on the screen?
Non-sensory.
It's a non-sensory perception, right? More precisely,
You have to produce it yourself.
you have to produce it yourself.
So,
A thought.
Through thought.
It is a thought.
A thought. Yes, it is a thought, and the thought has what kind of a character?
It's a concept.
It's a concept, yes, but what's the quality of the concept, of a thought?
Logical.
It's logical, yes.
Spiritual.
What's the substance of it?
Non-material.
It's non-material, but emotions are also non-material. Has it the same quality as emotions? No. But as opposed to emotions, how would you describe that?
Mathematical,
Objective.
Yes, it's objective, but
lawful.
Lawful.
it's lawful, yes.
It's impersonal or universal.
It's universal.
Intellectual soul.
Yes, it's intellectual. It's ideal. You know, it's ideal. In German, we call that geistig, which is the same word as spiritual, right?
Yeah.
So we would distinguish between sensory perceptions, seeing the flower out there, emotional perception, if we have joy, you know, enjoy this beautiful pattern. This creates in us an emotion. We haven't talked about that now, but all of you can feel that. And third, we come to the concept of it. Now, how does this relate to the pattern we saw? What does that have to do with this pattern? Somebody said something that we're seeing the pattern here. In what way?
Lawfulness.
Yes, it's a lawfulness. I just make a little geometrical drawing now, and those of you who are geometers or mathematicians, please excuse the simplicity with which a medical doctor does it. So, I do the same thing as here, but I transform it into a geometrical pattern, right? So here I go 1, I start here. Then I make an additional assumption, there is a certain angle, and I go like this, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. What happens? Yes. You get a curve. So that's a very simple, actually not a very professional derivation of the pattern, but that's actually what you see. You have these curves, 2 sets of curves that interweave. So the interesting thing is, we have this universal pattern with it, which is mathematically there, right? And the point I want to make, you all know that, but very often people don't think so much about that. That which we inwardly perceive in our thinking as a law also exists out here. The reality out there, the sensory material reality, is formed according to laws. And this is an example where you can see that very easily. And in fact, this law is the law of Fibonacci. Fibonacci was a monk in the 13th century who he was a mathematician, and he thought this law, and now we can see that nature behaves according to such law. Now, what's the point I would like to make? The point is that this spiritual, objective lawfulness that we discover only within us, not on the board, because you saw it inward in you, and then I put the numbers on the board, but you discovered it, you have to discover them inside of you. And this spiritual, innerly perceived element, the law, is actually out there in nature too, right? Now, what does that mean for the reality of nature? If sense-perceptible nature is formed according to spiritual
laws and really formed. Because that law out there is identical with the law that you are able to think. Is that clear? But what does that mean for the reality out there? What is the reality out there? Is the reality only that which we perceive? No, apparently not. Because if this reality is really shaped according to laws, then the laws themselves somehow pertain to this outer reality as well. You understand? That's very, very important. That's the most important point, and I would like to show you that this is not only a, let's say, a philosophical tenet, but it is also physically appropriate. I would like to read something by Walter Heitler. Walter Heitler was a physicist of the 20th century. He was professor at the Swiss Institute of Technology in Zurich. And he said the following, that deals exactly what we have just spoken about. He talks about the physical laws and says, the physical laws, are strictly formulated in the form of mathematical expressions, and the physical processes follow them. A mathematical law is a spiritual entity. We may call it this because it is the human spirit which discerns it. The expression spirit may not be very popular nowadays. This was said in 1972, wherein excessive materialism and positivism bear their often very unsavory fruit. But for this very reason, we need to become clear about what knowledge of nature and natural laws is. Nature follows this non-material element, the law. Consequently, spiritual elements are embedded in nature itself. Amongst these are mathematics, which is necessary for formulating the laws, in fact, higher and even the highest mathematics. On the other hand, the researcher who is lucky enough to make a discovery is in a position to recognize this element which permeates nature, spiritual element which permeates nature. And this is where the connection appears between the human knowing spirit and the transcendental elements which exist in nature. The best way of understanding matter is if we make use of the Platonic way of expressing ourselves, although Plato was not aware of these kind of natural laws that we know today. According to this, the natural law is an archetype, an idea, in the sense of the Greek word idea, which nature follows and which the human spirit can perceive. We perceive in our thinking the laws. We don't produce them. Our production is just our thinking power, but this thinking power does not invent the laws, but finds the laws. They have objective universal value. That's why all of you were, well, agreed that these solutions were correct, right? This is important. So what we actually do when we gain knowledge, and I don't want to dwell too long on that, but that is, we make observations, we think about these observations. Secondly, we find laws, and thirdly, we relate these laws to what we perceive. So we have in cognition percepts, we come to concepts through our thinking, which actually is an inner perception of laws, law content, which is of a universal, real nature, because nature even behaves according to these laws. And thirdly, we relate these laws to the percepts. Percepts and concepts have to be congruent, because if we would here apply another law than the Fibonacci law, it would not be correct. The law itself might be correct, but the relation is not correct. So all these three elements have to be there: percept, concept, and their correct correlation. This is what Steiner, in his basic epistemological writings, like theory of knowledge and good, as world conception, or philosophy of freedom, or truth and science, delineates. I say this now because when one realizes how cognition goes, which of course one can only do if you observe what you do when you cognize the world, and you have to observe that, and then of course everyone would agree that basically these are the three elements that we use in order to gain correct knowledge about the world. Then you come also to an understanding of what these laws mean for the world, for reality. And so that's the next point I would like to discuss. I think we can put that away. So the consequence of epistemology is the science of knowing. Actually, we don't need this word, but that's just a term which is used in science for the science of science, the science of cognition. That's epistemology. But what's the consequence of this? The consequence of this is that if really the laws that we think have an objective value, and nature is really formed according to these laws, then, as we already said, laws are part of reality. They belong to reality. They are real elements. And this now has consequences for our world conception. Because then, what is matter then? According to what we already said, matter cannot be only that which we perceive out there as matter. To matter belongs the lawful essence according to which matter is structured, right? So matter actually has two elements, or two aspects. One aspect is the appearance of matter, which is sensory perceptible, and the other one is the lawful essence of matter. And I say essence because if matter is really formed according to these laws, then the laws are the essential principle. Matter has to behave according to these laws. So the law-giving principle is actually the essential principle, not the appearance, but the essence. And that's the reason why not only Walter Heitler, but also Werner Heisenberg in English, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, also two very eminent physicists of the 20th century, come to formulations like the following when they talk about matter. What is matter really? Heisenberg, for example, there he talks about Democritus' atoms. He thought atoms were really existing parts, right? And Heisenberg corrects that in a certain way and says, the smallest parts of matter are not the fundamental beings, as in the philosophy of Democritus or today's materialistic concepts, but are mathematical forms. Mathematical forms. Here it is quite evident that the form is more important than the substance of which it is the form. Right? So it's like in Aristotle, substance is the unity of form, which is the law, and matter, which is the sense-perceptible aspect of substance. And the form is the more essential element. Or von Weizsäcker, in an article of year 2000, he says, already in the 20th century, the quantum theory showed that the atomic structures cannot be viewed as objects, as physically tangible particles corresponding to the clear world of ideas of classical physics in the sense of the Descartesian res extensa. To date, they have been consistently described only as mathematical structures. That means these both physicists come to the conclusion after quantum physics that what has remained of the earlier concepts of matter has all thrown out of the window, and the only thing that remains is mathematical structure. But what are mathematical structures? Laws, spirit. So there are also today some physicists which would clearly say actually matter is spirit in its core, in its essence. If you think that through, then it becomes clear that our worldview changes considerably. Then there is, of course, a place for spirit in matter or in physics, because the essence of matter is spirit. Do you agree? Or this? Okay. So that's the way it is in physics, and in chemistry. In consequence, it's also this way. Let's look at the chemical problem. What you see here is a flask with a grayish little bright, little shining substance.
Sodium. Sodium.
Right, sodium. It's sodium. It's not, these are not crystals, but it's like a cheese, you know, cut in pieces. Actually, it's an amorphous substance, sodium. Natrium. So the next one is chlorine. You see also a flask, it's a gas, a little greenish here, a poisonous, stinking gas. And, well, you all know that if you combine that, then you get what we call NaCl, sodium chloride. And usually one thinks in these thinking models that that's the way it is, right? You have chlorine and sodium atoms, which are conceived to be aggregated as a crystal in such a way. That's our thought model. But the thought models consist actually in a combination of the substances as they were before they entered the crystal. But what you can perceive is that you get something completely different. That's what you really perceive. That's the phenomenon. This phenomenon has properties that you cannot find in chlorine or in sodium. And you cannot predict from knowing these both substances as elements, you cannot predict the properties of salt, of kitchen salt. For example, this cubic structure does not exist, neither in this gas nor in the amorphous natrium. And you would not be able to predict that. Now, I know that this is usually not the general opinion, because then one refers to these models and says, well, you can just, add them and that, then the eventual thing will be this. But the problem is that the properties of kitchen salt cannot be foreseen from a knowledge of the components. And this is an essential thing. This is a problem that has persisted, which is usually not acknowledged in medicine, for example. We never heard about this problem. And also in biology, and so one doesn't talk about that. But when you read, like in Science, in an article, well, it's already a bit older now, it was published in 1988. And there, John Maddox, who was the editor of Science at the time, he wrote the following. The article is entitled "With Crystals from First Principles." And the thing was that they tried to calculate the properties of chemical wholes from the knowledge of their parts. The problem is that usually this doesn't function. What he says is, one of the continuing scandals in the physical sciences is that it remains in general impossible to predict the structure of even the simplest crystalline solids from a knowledge of their chemical composition. Solids, such as crystalline water, ice, are still thought to lie beyond mortal's ken. Beyond mortal's ken. While mortals, what lies beyond mortal's ken in the Egyptian mysteries, that would have been the pupils who have not reached a certain stage of their initiation, so they would not be able to, they were still mortals, and their ken, which is an old name for knowledge, right, would not be sufficient. So you see that it's almost like a mystery language somehow enters these scientific publications here, which is very interesting. But then the point is the following. In the same issue of Science, there is an article by a Japanese group who took the knowledge of silicon and oxygen in order to calculate the structures of silicates, right? And they fed all what they knew about parts in order to, define or to derive the properties of the whole. And they used supercomputers, etc. But then the way they did that was the following. They needed, in order to do it, knowledge about the already existing silicates, already existing holes. Only then could they, through very complicated mathematical operations, somehow made a calculation, but this calculation was not a derivation of the properties of the whole from the properties of the parts. That's what Maddox says here too. He says, in themselves, of course, these results are not a fulfillment of the goal of calculating from first principles, which means from the element, the crystal structure of the compound, of which nothing is known except chemical composition. So, on the face of things, the most obvious artificially introduced variables are the known crystal structures of the polymorphs of silica used as a starting point for the molecular dynamics. So you need both, the whole and the parts, and then you can make a calculation. Why or in what way can you do this? There I would like to briefly point to Hans Primas, who was professor for physikalische Chemie, physical and theoretical chemistry. I think that's the way it's pronounced in English. Also at the Swiss Institute of Technology in the 1980s, 90s. And he made some very interesting publications about the problem of reductionism and reasons why reductionism doesn't function. And there he distinguishes two forms of reductionism. One is what he calls a reductionism in the strong sense, which is a pure logical derivation of the emergent whole from its parts. So that means to deduce the law of the whole from its parts. And that, he says, is in principle not possible. The only thing which is possible is what he calls a weak reductionism. And that means, I quote, through asymptotic, is that the right way to pronounce it?
Asymptotic. Asymptotic.
Through asymptotic limit processes to successively create a whole of molecular descriptions from a first principles of quantum mechanics. Asymptotic limit process. What's an asymptotic limit process? Depicted in a symbolic way. We could say that this is a line, and this symbolizes the properties of the whole, and here are the properties of the parts. Then the asymptotic approach is that you never reach this line, right? That mathematically is called asymptotic. But only through certain mathematical procedures, he says, through a pedantically careful mathematical analysis, it is possible to demonstrate the, what he says, the compatibility of the properties of the whole with the properties of the part. The compatibility, but the compatibility is not the deducibility, right? That's the point. That's the way one can today calculate wholes from parts, not in any other way. So in that sense, reductionism has failed. This, what we just talked about, is called emergence, the problem of emergence. I don't think I have to write it on the table, right? Emergence. And that's a very important word to remember, but also what it exactly means. What is emergence? I read to you, it's also in my book. Where is it? Here. That's a quotation from a little article. Actually, it's an editorial or a comment in the Journal of the Swiss Science Foundation, National Science Foundation of Switzerland, where Bertrand Kiefer says the following: emergence is one of the most puzzling but fundamental phenomena of the universe. It is the appearance of new characteristics at each higher level of complexity, which cannot be predicted from the previous level. It's a fundamental thing. That's emergence. An example, the characteristics of life cannot be deduced from lifeless matter. However far we pursue research in physics and chemistry, this route will never enable us to predict the specific behavior of living organisms. It appears to be a generally valid principle that the complex whole cannot be traced back to its simple parts. This includes all stages of increased complexity. At the level of the atom, observing hydrogen and oxygen atoms in isolation gives no clue to the characteristics of a water molecule. At the end of the scale, the characteristics of consciousness do not result from the extrapolation of behavior. It would be better to say from the functioning of the brain, right? We'll talk about that day after tomorrow. Emergence gives rise to an important conclusion. Reductionism is a false doctrine, right? Very important. So these are new voices in science. They are not unfrequent, but they are not mainstream in the sense that they are already taught at university, but they are there, and they are really going to bring science in a completely new direction. Because after all, what does that mean for the notion of our substance? If substance, in the sense of epistemology, as Steiner sees it, is not only what we perceive with sense perception, but also the law, then what does that mean for our concepts of substance when we go from the so-called atoms like chlorine and sodium to salt? What does that mean? Because apparently salt has its own laws, right? For example, a structural law, this cubic law is something which does not exist in the elements. So if we say that the reality of a substance is the unity of what we can possibly perceive with the lawfulness of what we perceive, then what is salt? It's also a reality. That means not only the substances of the periodic system are real, but there are higher order substances which are not contained in the periodic system, but which come to existence when the substances of the periodic system interact and become a whole, right? Is that clear? And this leads to a completely different notion of what substance actually is. I'm not only arguing from the point of epistemology from which this is all logical. It's actually something you have to infer, but it's a new notion of substance which already exists in chemistry itself, and that is the following. For example, Hans Primas He says the following. In 1992, atomism claims that matter is composed of the tiniest building blocks which cannot be divided any further, and that natural processes must be explained from the properties and motion of these atoms. However, atoms, electrons, quarks, or strings are not the building blocks of matter. Now comes something very paradox, which you might not have heard yet. But this is one of the specialists for matter, right? Professor for Physikalische Chemie, physical and theoretical chemistry at the Institute of Technology. Modern physics has retained nothing of the original concept of matter. If we believe quantum mechanics to be a good theory of matter, then the statement, matter is made up of elementary building blocks, is scientifically incorrect. The decisive point is not that the chemist's atom can be further divided, but, now comes one of these important sentences, but that the material reality as a whole is not built up from parts at all. Now listen to that, right? It's not built up at all from its part. We will talk about that in a moment. The dialectics of whole and part in the quantum world is fundamentally different from the usual descriptions in classical sciences. Due to empirical scientific reasons, not theoretical, physics was forced, in the face of stiff resistance from the most philosophers, to recognize the holistic nature of the world of matter. In the view of modern quantum physics, material reality is a whole, and what is more, a whole which is not composed of parts. He keeps repeating himself. But one has to hear that, right? Because it's so revolutionary that if one hears that from such a person at this position, one should actually just, fall off the table. Quantum mechanics is the first logically consistent and mathematically thought through theory. The concept of wholeness in modern physics is much more comprehensive than the holistic approaches of the other natural sciences. While this is not quite true, he didn't know Goethe, because Goethe had already created such a science in biology, which is holistic in the sense, but it's interesting that even without Goethe, someone comes in physics and chemistry to such a notion of holistic. But how can we understand this? This is so paradox, To say something does not consist of parts, although we know exactly that the parts are in it. You understand? Well, they are not in the form they had been before they were in this whole. They are in another form. Now this was Hans Primas in 1992. Now let's listen to Rudolf Steiner, where he talks of the proteins in 1923. Listen to his wording and compare this with what you just heard from Hans Primas. Rudolf Steiner. Today, we generally think of things as being formed by combination, but that is nonsense. What we know as certain higher substances are not always composed of what appears when they are analyzed, for these things cease to be present in the higher substance. Carbon is not present there as carbon, nor oxygen as oxygen,
but there is a substance of a higher order. Again, very paradoxical, but it's exactly the same thing as Hans Primas says. It is in there, but it's not in there. How to understand this? We can understand this, and that's my conviction, if we really consider that reality is not only what we perceive, but that the essential thing of reality is its lawfulness. And this lawfulness, by the way, is not just an abstract law as we think it, as abstract ideas, but these are acting laws. And that's different. If you think, for example, just the thought of a biting dog, the dog, this thought, will not bite you, right? If you think the law of the force of a magnet, this law will not attract any iron nails. Only the real law, that means the law which is a unity with the force. Actually, laws are forces. These are acting laws, and that's the reason why David Bohm, I think he was American, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And David Peat, also an American, also a physicist of the 20th century, came up with the notion of active information. Active information. They said that actually, in addition to what is classically known as matter and energy, we should introduce a third element, and that is active information. Active information. Well, what is information? Is that something material? No. Information is what? What is information?
Non-material, spiritual.
Yes, also. It's actually, it's another word for ideas, you know, plans or whatever. Information. It's that which will be informed in matter. That's information. It's also spirit. It's the same. It's actually thoughts. So again, active thoughts. This is acting spirit, not abstract spirit. The concepts, the laws in the way we think them are always abstract. They're not active. They're dead, so to speak. That's why we perceive them as abstract. But out there in reality, if reality is really formed according to these laws, they must contain an activity. Otherwise, matter could not be formed according to these laws, right? In order to form something, you need force, right? If you shape something in modeling, you need force, an idea and force. In reality, the ideas of nature, the laws of nature are themselves active spiritual principles. So, now this, if we consider this, I think we can come to an understanding what emergence is about. Let's, for this, purpose, listen to something else Steiner said. This was in 1911. In a first lecture cycle he had about physiology from a spiritual perspective, and there he talks about kitchen salt, and says the following about kitchen salt. Take, for example, kitchen salt or sodium chloride. Here you have, according to our present-day physics, the physical substance chlorine and sodium, a gas and a mineral. You will readily see that these two substances, prior to their entrance into the entity which lays hold upon them in such a way that their chemical union, in their chemical union, they appear crystallized into a cube, have nothing in them that can indicate to us such a form principle. We have already talked about that. Now, before they enter into this form principle, they possess nothing in common, but they are seized upon and yoked together by this form principle, and there is then produced this physical body, kitchen salt. So Steiner talks about an active form principle, which is nothing but active information, right? In other words, so the notion behind that is the active law of the superior level penetrates, pervades, permeates the reality of the elements in such a way that these elements cannot, let's say, they are like repressed in the activity of their laws. That's the reason why they disappear for the appearance. But they are still there, but not in the form they were there before. We could call this form a form of latency. They become like latent. You know this expression, right? Latent. Latent. It's not. It's there, but in a hidden form. And not behind a tree, but they are not manifested in the external reality, although they are there in a non-manifested reality, form of reality. So that's the concept of latent. For example, those who might not be familiar with latency, if you boil water to cook an egg for 3 minutes, then you put in heat, right? The more you put in, the more the temperature rises. Then it goes to 100 degrees centigrade. How much in Fahrenheit? Huh? 12. Okay. And then what happens then?
Stays there.
Then it starts to evaporate, right? Steam. But what's the temperature of the boiling water which evaporates?
It's the same.
The same. It remains the same, although you pump in more and more heat. So the heat is not apparent anymore. Where did the heat go? It's not there anymore. It cannot be measured. Well, the heat can be measured, but it does not appear in a manifested form, although it is still there in another form, in a non-manifest form. That's latency. That's also the reason why when you burn the wood in your chimneys, then what do you get out? You get out warmth, which has been put in earlier when the sun was shining and the plants grew. The warmth became latent. So did the light. But it's still in there in a latent form. And when you burn it, it comes out again. That's why you burn your wood in your stove. So I realize that these are maybe not common thoughts, but they are necessary in order to think reality, I would say, more realistically, as it really functions. So we came now to the notion, on the one side from epistemology, that the essence of matter are laws, and in that sense spirit. Then that means if we look at different levels of the emergent reality in chemistry, we must say every level has the same validity as far as reality is concerned. Salt is just as real as sodium and chloride, right? So it has its own laws. So we have a hierarchy of laws where always the relatively higher law suppresses the lower law, and that's why the totality then shows externally the sense perceptible properties that pertain to this law, and not to the laws of the submergent elements. So, and this is why Hans Primas, for example, says that we have to realize that science does not mean to reduce the higher level properties to their lowermost elements, but means to find out at each level the appropriate lawfulness, which you can because you have certain new appearances, and these new appearances are lawful. Like what we said about the cube, the cubic structure of the kitchen saw, that has its own lawfulness. And therefore, he says, science has to be necessarily pluralistic. Pluralistic means every level of emergent nature has to be cognized in the sense, epistemologically spoken, that you look at it, you observe it, and with your thinking you search for the laws. And after you have done that, then you can, of course, analyze how are the interdependencies between the different levels. But these interdependencies are not a deducibility, as we saw, but are have to be thought in such a way that the lower elements are always the conditions in which the higher laws can enact. You need sodium and chloride in order for the salt principle to enact. Of course, you can't take any other substances, so we always have a lawful relation between the higher levels and the lower levels, right? And but it's an interdependency of conditions, or of a medium in which these laws enact. Now, this has now a consequence for the question of causality.
Of what?
Causality. What are causes in nature? We are accustomed to a mechanistic form of causality, a linear form of causality, where things are external to each other and act upon each other in that external mode, like this, right? This is mechanics. But there is another form of causality, which is very often not considered in natural sciences. Rudolf Steiner points to these two forms of causality I would like to mention now in his theory of knowledge, in the chapter about inorganic nature, where he says the following. He says, in organic nature, the simplest form of action in nature seems to us to be that in which an occurrence results wholly from factors external to each other. The occurrence or relationship that we observe has been called forth merely by the fact that one thing which has occurred has, in its occurrence, produced a certain effect upon another thing, has transferred its own states to some other thing, like in mechanical actions and reactions. The states of one thing appear as results of those of another. The car bounces on the next one, right? That's typical example. The system of actions which happen in this fashion, so that one fact is always the result of other Others of similar sort, which means external, in an external opposition, is called inorganic nature. It becomes very clear from this point, at this point that Steiner means here mechanical inorganic nature. Because in what I just read to you about the crystallization principles, this is another form of causality already existing in physics and in chemistry. And this is also mentioned here by Steiner in another sentence where he says, he talks about a relationship between two objects which is necessitated by an entity which manifests itself in the external forms of appearance, or an individuality which exhibits its capacities and character in an effect produced outwardly. So that means an essence, in German it says here, not an entity, well, one can translate it like this, but it says Wesen, and Wesen means essence and entity at the same time. So essence is Wesen. It means an essence which enacts itself and works inwardly in something and expresses itself outwardly. This is an inner form of causality. So that when a form principle like this enacts itself, it permeates its elements, like sodium and chloride, and produces a new appearance, which then is solved, right? It works from inside out. Do you understand what I mean? This happens in physics, in crystals. That's a physical process, but also in chemistry, when new substances, emergent substances are produced, wholes from parts. That's this kind of an enactment. And that's also the reason why the enacting higher principle represses the lower ones. It does it from the inside, so to speak. This is an inner causality. And then in life, the forces of life are, again, another, let's say, level of emergent principles which enact themselves in time, not only in space, but in time. Again, they work from inside out. Life forces cannot be imagined as being external to the matter in which they enact, but they penetrate matter, so matter itself becomes living. That's how Steiner depicts it, for example, in the fundamentals of therapy, where there are very interesting thoughts in this very direction. And if you consider what we try to outline today, you will understand what he says. That life is, and also the next higher level of the soul forces enact themselves from the inside. That's why we have a physiognomy. That's why the animal body is not a plant body, because the animal being expresses itself also in the outside, working from the inside in a holistic manner all the time. And so the human individuality also, which enacts itself in this living, ensouled human organism. So these are levels of emergent causality, or principles of different classes in a hierarchical manner, which enact themselves from the inside. And only the very lowest level, when substances are dead and act outwardly upon each other, we get what we usually consider the linear kind of causality that we know. This means that we really have a new causality here. And as a matter of fact, I have the impression that in chaos theory, one deals with these higher forms of causality. For example, when one of these authors says that I don't find it. Oh, Keller, for example, when he talks of a geometrical causation. Geometrical. That means geometrical form principles informing crystal or crystal-like forms, which are not a matter of a local interaction of parts, but geometrical causation, form principle as such. So what we have here is a reappearance in science of what Aristotle called the causa formalis. Causa formalis, form, what do you call that?
Formal cause.
Formal cause. So Aristotle distinguished 4 different causes. Causa materialis, material cause. Causa efficiens, efficient cause. Causa formalis, formal cause. And causa finalis, final cause. Now, this has remained from the ancient Aristotelian causality, just matter and forces, and by which one means material forces only. One has lost this. But this comes up again in the active information, in the geometrical form principles, in the form principles as Steiner said it. And for me, this discovery that Steiner already in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century brought forth these concepts, which today more and more also appear in natural sciences. And so that means we have to rethink also our notion of causality. And in this context, another, maybe a last the concept of self-organization. Those of you who deal with natural sciences are certainly aware of the fact that more and more one talks about self-organization in nature. For example, crystals are self-organizing. The organism organizes itself. All its structures are self-organizing. The usual notion of that is that parts assemble by themselves in the whole. But we have just seen that this doesn't function. This is just a basic assumption. But the facts are such that you cannot derive the wholes from that. It's the other way around. Self-organization means that the superior form principle or substance principle enacts itself. This is top-down and not bottom-up. Of course, there is a bottom-up condition. You always need the lower level, of course. For example, life does not just float around in this room, but our bodies need substances in order for life to enact itself, right? And so is it with our soul and spirit. As long as we live. After we die, it's a different thing. But what the consequence of this is also that if you really conceive the higher levels of laws and forces as just as real as the lowest ones, then of course you also come to the notion that as long as something is not enacted, well, it's apparently not in matter. So where is it then? That's another very interesting question. Maybe we can tomorrow in the recap we can talk about this, because this is also a very important question, also in natural sciences. Where do these self-enacting laws come from? They are not in substance. They do not come out of substance. They enact themselves in substance. So they must be somewhere else. And that's the big question, where they come from. Also there, physics has very interesting approaches today. And for me, this is was one of the also detections that actually in physics, there has been a certain turnaround in, let's say, in natural sciences, which has not yet been adequately perceived and adequately valued, appreciated. It's a turnaround that substance in its essence is spiritual. It's a turnaround that this spirit in actually is an acting spirit. And it's a turnaround that, if you take consequences of that, the whole of nature, in as far material nature now, I'm talking about material nature. We could leave away life now. We will talk about life tomorrow. But just if we look at the physical nature of our human body, then we have a whole hierarchy of laws, you know, in that which we call macromolecules, organelles, cells, cell systems, organs, organ systems, etc. All these levels are emergent from each other and cannot be derived from the lower ones. So our physical body is a gigantic, organized, let's say, structure of laws. It's of a complexity that we can hardly imagine. And more one gets into the details, the more one can really realize how complicated this is. But it's all physically organized. It's a gigantic physical organization, but of a hierarchical form, very complex. But each level is as real as the lower levels. And then you come to a totally different appreciation of what the organism really is, the physical organism. We're not talking about life and soul and spirit, but just the physical organism. That's so important, and the whole of nature. So nature, in its physical totality, is only outwardly material in the sense of sense perceptible. In its essence, everything is spirit, also matter. That's what I mean by turnaround, that physics really came to this notion. Of course, it's only the most advanced physicists like Heisenberg and others who really checked that, you know. For example, if you read the book of Werner Heisenberg, Physics and Philosophy, I don't know if it exists in English, probably yes. Yeah. Physik und Philosophie, which actually it goes in this very direction. And so we could learn much from physics, but it's very interesting that already from epistemology, you come to the notion that it must be so. And that's one of the achievements of Steiner, that already in the late 19th century, he found, let's say, the epistemological foundations of a new natural science which goes in this direction. And what happens now actually is a confirmation of things Steiner said in this direction. So I gradually come to a close with that. Yes, this is about what I wanted to say, and this also shows, to me at least, how important epistemology is. Because what do you do in epistemology? In epistemology, you start to observe your own consciousness. There you notice that, yes, in each cognitional act, you search for these spiritual elements, the thought. You relate them to the percepts. You find that percepts are organized according to such laws. But you also find, and that's a fact of an inner observation, that you experience your thoughts as something non-material. And you can also experience that they have a reality in themselves. And maybe that's the last thing we can talk about tonight. Because the epistemology in the sense of Popper and Kant and modern constructivism actually says the opposite. It says our thoughts are products of our thinking. Well, today one even says products of our brain. Now, when we realize that what we just did in the beginning, that we come up with the same concepts, with the same mathematical solutions, so obviously it's something universal. Secondly, if one says, and this is very often said, well, it's just a convention. These so-called laws are conventions. So the human mind, for example, has a convention that prime numbers cannot be divided by other numbers so that an integer results, right? That's just a convention. Well, okay, so one could say, show me, first of all, the evidence where this convention was made. Secondly, if it is a convention, then try to make another convention. then decide that from today on, we decide altogether from today on, we decide that prime numbers can be divided. Now, if you try to do that, what happens? It doesn't work. Why does it work?
It's illegal.
It's against the law.
Are you planning to get into the Supreme Court? No, it doesn't work. Why? And that's very important. Try to formulate what you really experience when you do that. What you experience. What you really inwardly experience. When you try to divide a prime number by another number, what happens? What do you experience when it doesn't work?
I'm not sure what you're asking. Not quite following.
What's your experience? Why? I ask, why can't you do it? You must have a reason.
Well, your sense of evidence is violated.
A numerical structure that is one of the informing, or what's called informed principles.
Yeah, there's a structure to it. Yeah, right. And you experience that.
You're aware of the lawfulness, like I said, that you can't violate.
Yeah, you're aware of lawfulness of a structure that you encounter that you cannot change. I like to make the parallel or the metaphor of when you make a walk in the Alps and you go a small path and there comes a big, huge granite rock and you don't like it to be there because you would have to go around it and go steep down, and you tell them, so go away, and you try to move them, right? Well, what does the rock say?
I'm not moving.
It's just standing there. And passive resistance. Passive resistance. In the very same way, you experience a passive resistance when you try to think the lawfulness other than it is in itself. And that subtle experience, an inner spiritual experience, is the experience of something spiritual which withstands you. It is passively resistance. You run against it, right? You can't do anything. It's like a granite rock, but in a spiritual form. That's so in mathematics. You cannot play with mathematics. Mathematics says how it wants to be thought. It's the objectivity. That's why we call it objective, because we inwardly feel an inner object, which means ob means like an encounter. It's outward. It's thrown against us. That actually means objective. And we feel that. That's an inner experience. So the question whether laws are subjectively produced, conventions, or whether they are inherent realities, entities in themselves, is not a question which can be decided theoretically, but a question which can only be decided empirically. And that's the reason why epistemology, for example, is so important, because there, if you start to really inwardly observe what you actually perceive spiritually when you think, you start to come at certain borders where you feel a spiritual resistance. It's something spiritual which just stands there as a granite rock stands. It doesn't come actively out to you, fortunately. Like the granite rock also doesn't come, so if it does, then you're in trouble, right? But you might also be mentally in trouble if these walls just come out to you, right? This sometimes also happens.
Furniture sometimes attacks you.
Yeah. So that leads us also to, well, I would like to close with that because, I wanted to make a certain, way just to show today why, for epistemological reasons, but also for reasons of physics and chemistry, we must say that laws are reality, and spiritual laws. And the last part we will use in the fourth lecture, where we will try to see how this inner experience that we have in thinking, in active thinking of some things of a spiritual reality, can be enhanced in such a way that we do not only perceive abstract spirit, which is a reality already, but living spirit, right? So that will be the last thing. For today, I think it's enough. Now we have also talked 5 minutes too long.